The auctioneer's voice cracked on the last call. Sold to the gentleman in the back row for $14,000. The gentleman in the back row was 85 years old. He'd just bought his 9th farm, paid cash. And every single one of those farms had once belonged to someone who'd told him he was finished. But 36 years earlier, in 1967, a John Deere dealer had looked at this same man and said 6 words that started everything. "You're too old for this, Earl." Before I take you back to 1967, let me tell you something. This channel tells the stories that nobody else is telling. The forgotten farmers, the overlooked land, the deals that changed everything. If you believe these stories deserve to be heard, hit subscribe right now. Every subscriber tells me to keep digging for the next story. And trust me, the one I'm about to tell you is worth staying for. Let me take you back. Earl Hawkins was 49 years old in March of 1967 when he walked into Granger's John Deere dealership in Platte City, Missouri. He'd been farming 120 acres of river-bottom ground along the Missouri River since 1946, the year he came home from the Pacific. 21 years on the same land, same small operation, same 2 tractors, a 1946 Farmall H and a 1953 Farmall Super M he'd bought used in 1958. Earl wasn't flashy, didn't talk much, wore the same style of clothes every day: khaki work pants, a gray cotton shirt, brown boots he resoled every 2 years instead of replacing. He had hands like leather gloves and a face that looked like it had been carved out of walnut by someone who didn't believe in smooth edges. He'd come into Granger's for a hydraulic fitting, that's all, a $4 part. But Donnie Granger saw an opportunity. Donnie was 36 years old, 3rd-generation dealer. His grandfather had sold John Deere equipment in Platte County since 1928. Donnie had taken over in 1962 and was hungry to grow the business. He wore pressed green shirts with the John Deere logo, polished boots, and a college ring from Mizzou. He had a sales quota and a mortgage on a dealership expansion he'd just finished. "Earl Hawkins," Donnie said, leaning against the parts counter. "Haven't seen you in here in a while. Don't need much, just a hydraulic fitting for the Super M. That tractor's what, 14 years old now? Runs fine." Donnie smiled the way salesmen smile when they think they've found a weakness. "Earl, can I be honest with you? I'd prefer it. You're farming 120 acres with a tractor from 1946 and another from 1953. Combined age of those machines is older than most people in this county. You're almost 50 years old. The guys around you are expanding, mechanizing, getting efficient. Tom Bridwell just bought a 4020. Jerry Combs traded up to a 3020 and added 200 acres. These guys are building real operations. Good for them. Earl, I'm not trying to insult you. I'm trying to help you. You're too old for this, too old to be farming with equipment from the Truman administration, too old to be doing everything the hard way. If you don't modernize now, in 5 years, you'll be too far behind to catch up." Earl looked at Donnie Granger, looked at his pressed shirt, his college ring, his confident smile, thought about the fact that Donnie had never planted a seed in his life. "Donnie, how much is that hydraulic fitting?" $375. I'll take the fitting. Keep the advice." He paid, walked out, and drove home. Behind him, Donnie said something to his parts manager that drifted through the screen door. "That old man is going to farm himself right into the ground." Now let me tell you about Earl Hawkins, because the man Donnie Granger dismissed was not the man Donnie thought he was. Earl had been born in 1918 on a farm outside Smithville, Missouri. His father, Russell Hawkins, had farmed 90 acres through the Depression without losing a single acre, not because he was lucky, because Russell Hawkins had a rule that he drilled into Earl from the time the boy could walk. Never owe more than you can pay off in one bad year. Russell never borrowed more than one season's income. If a piece of equipment cost more than he could pay back from a single harvest, he didn't buy it. If land cost more than he could cover from one year's work, he waited. This made him the slowest growing farmer in Platte County. It also made him the only one who kept his farm through the 1930s. Earl carried that rule like a stone in his pocket. He'd bought his 120 acres in 1946 for $6,200, paid it off in 4 years, bought the Farmall H that same year for $800, and the Super M in 1958 for $1,400. Both paid in cash. He'd never had a bank payment in his life. By 1967, Earl had $38,000 in savings. 21 years of farming, living below his means, fixing everything himself, spending nothing he didn't have to spend. His neighbors didn't know about the savings. They saw the old tractors, the modest house, the worn-out truck, and assumed Earl was barely getting by. They were wrong. Let me tell you about what happened around Earl between 1967 and 1975, because this is where everyone else planted the seeds of their own destruction. The late 1960s and early 1970s were boom times in Missouri agriculture. Grain prices were climbing, export markets were expanding. The USDA was telling farmers to plant fence row to fence row. Land values were rising 10 to 15% a year. Every farm magazine, every extension agent, every equipment dealer had the same message: expand now. Borrow to grow. Leverage is your friend. Donnie Granger's dealership was printing money. He sold 19 new tractors in 1968 alone. Every sale came with financing. Every financing deal came with interest. Every farmer who signed a note believed the good times would last forever. Tom Bridwell expanded from 300 to 640 acres, financed a new 4020, a combine, and a grain truck. Total debt $86,000. Jerry Combs. Went from 200 to 520 acres. New 3,020, new planter, new barn, debt $72,000. Dale Fenton bought 400 acres he couldn't afford at $380 an acre, financed at 9%. Added another $40,000 in equipment debt. Total exposure $192,000. Everyone was growing. Everyone was borrowing. Everyone was confident. Earl Hawkins farmed his same 120 acres with his same 2 Farmalls, planted corn and soybeans, rotated every year, put money in the bank, drove the same truck, wore the same boots, went to bed early and got up earlier. Donnie Granger drove past Earl's place every week on his way to a customer's farm. Every time he saw those old red Farmalls in the yard, he shook his head. Once, at the diner, someone asked Donnie about Earl. Earl Hawkins? He's a relic, farming the same way his daddy farmed in the Depression. Won't modernize, won't expand, won't listen to reason. I give him 5 more years before he's done. But Earl wasn't done. Earl was doing math, and the math was telling him something that Donnie Granger couldn't see from inside his shiny green dealership. I want to ask you something. Have you ever watched everyone around you rush toward something you knew was dangerous and felt crazy for standing still? Drop a comment and tell me about it, because what Earl saw coming, nobody else wanted to believe. By 1975, Earl had $74,000 in savings. He was 57 years old. The Farmall H was 29. The Super M was 22. Both still running. Both maintained by Earl's own hands in his own workshop every winter. His neighbors were leveraged to the ceiling. The expansion had continued through the early 1970s. Land prices kept climbing, equipment kept getting bigger and more expensive, debt kept stacking. Then Earl did something nobody expected. In September of 1975, he walked into the First National Bank of Platte City and asked to speak with the agricultural loan officer, a man named Charles Denton. "Earl Hawkins, don't think I've ever seen you in the loan department. Never had a reason to come in here before. Well, what can I do for you? I want to open a certificate of deposit, 12-month term. How much? 60,000. Charles set down his coffee. $60,000? Cash? Cash. Earl, where did you get $60,000 in cash? Same place I get everything. I earned it. Charles processed the CD. When Earl left, Charles told his colleague, "That old farmer just deposited more cash than half our borrowers have in equity." Earl kept $14,000 liquid for operating expenses and emergencies. He went home and kept farming, kept saving, kept waiting. Then 1980 arrived, and waiting became power. You know what happened next because it's the same story that echoes across every farming county in America. Interest rates exploded, grain prices collapsed, land values crashed. The farmers who'd borrowed to expand found themselves drowning in debt. They couldn't service on income that had been cut in half. Platte County was devastated. Tom Bridwell was the first to go. His $86,000 in debt had ballooned to $114,000 after missed payments and penalty interest. His 640 acres were worth less than what he owed. The bank foreclosed in March of 1982. Everything sold at auction in April. Tom was 51 years old. He moved to Kansas City, worked at a warehouse, never farmed again. Jerry Combs held on until 1983. Tried refinancing, tried selling equipment, tried cutting every cost he could find. Couldn't make the numbers work. The bank called his loans in August, auction in September. Jerry was 48. His wife left him the following year. He drove a grain truck for a co-op until he retired. Dale Fenton lost everything in 1984. His $192,000 in debt was the largest personal farm bankruptcy in Platte County history. The auction took 2 days. Dale was 55. He had a heart attack in 1986, survived it, but never fully recovered. Donnie Granger's dealership started bleeding in 1981 and never stopped. Every tractor he'd financed was now worth half what was owed. Every farmer he'd convinced to upgrade was either behind on payments or foreclosed. The gleaming dealership expansion he'd mortgaged in 1965 was eating him alive. Donnie closed Granger's John Deere in November of 1984. Third generation of dealers, finished. He sold insurance for the next 20 years. And Earl Hawkins? Earl's $60,000 CD had matured and been renewed twice. With interest, he now had over $80,000 in the bank. His 120 acres were paid off. His 2 Farmalls were paid off. His operating costs were minimal. No equipment payments, no land payments, no debt of any kind. When corn dropped to $2 a bushel and soybeans crashed, Earl tightened his belt and kept going. His annual expenses were so low that even the worst year still left him in the black. He didn't just survive the crisis, he thrived in it. Because Earl Hawkins went to auctions. Let me tell you about the auctions, because this is where Earl's patience turned into something nobody in Platte County had ever seen. The first auction Earl attended was Tom Bridwell's in April 1982. Earl watched his neighbor's life get sold off piece by piece: tractors, combines, trucks, tools, household goods. Tom stood off to the side with his family, watching strangers pick through 30 years of work. Earl bid on one item, Tom's 160-acre parcel on the east side of the river. The land Tom had bought in 1970 for $320 an acre and financed to the hilt. The bank's minimum bid was $180 an acre. Earl bid $180. Nobody countered. Sold. $28,800 for 160 acres, cash. After the auction, Earl found Tom. "Tom, I'm sorry about all this." Tom couldn't look at him. "You bought my east quarter." "I did." "You going to farm it?" "I am. But I want you to know something. If you ever want to come back to farming, you come see me. I'll put you to work. Fair wage, no charity, just work." Tom shook his head. "I'm done with farming, Earl. It broke me." "Farming didn't break you, Tom. Debt broke you. There's a difference." Tom looked at Earl for a long time. Then he said something that stayed with Earl for the rest of his life. "You tried to tell me, didn't you? Back in '68, when I bought the 4,020 and added those acres. You said something about my daddy's rule, never owe more than one bad year. I laughed at you, called you old-fashioned. I remember. Turns out old-fashioned is just another word for still standing." Earl went to more auctions. Jerry Combs's sale in 1983, Dale Fenton's in 1984, 3 smaller operations in 1985 and 1986. Each time he bought land at crisis prices, paid cash, never borrowed a dollar. By 1985, Earl Hawkins owned 520 acres. He was 67 years old. His total land investment over 40 years was about $96,000. That same land, even at depressed crisis values, was worth over $300,000. But Earl did something with that land that set him apart from every other buyer at those auctions. He didn't just farm it, he gave people a way back. Let me tell you about what Earl built, because this is where the story becomes about more than one man. In the spring of 1985, a 24-year-old named Danny Reeves knocked on Earl's door. Danny was Tom Bridwell's nephew. He'd grown up on Tom's farm, loved farming, but had no land, no equipment, and no money. Banks wouldn't look at him. No credit, no collateral, no family farm to back a loan. "Mr. Hawkins, I heard you bought some of my uncle's land. I was wondering if you need any help farming it." Earl looked at Danny, saw something he recognized. The hunger, the willingness. The same look Earl himself had when he came home from the Pacific in 1946, with nothing but determination. "I don't need help, but I'll make you a deal." Earl leased Danny 80 acres of the former Bridwell land. The terms were unlike anything a bank would have offered. No money down, rent was 20% of the crop, payable after harvest. If the crop failed, Danny owed nothing. If it succeeded, Danny kept 80%. Earl also lent Danny his Farmall H. The tractor was 39 years old. It was slow and loud and everything a modern farmer would laugh at, but it ran, and it was free. "Take care of that tractor," Earl told him. "It's older than you are, and it's earned more respect." Danny farmed those 80 acres for 4 years, paid Earl his 20% every harvest, saved everything else. In 1989, he had enough to buy 40 acres of his own at auction prices. Earl co-signed the note, the only time Earl ever put his name on someone else's debt. Danny paid it off in 3 years. Earl did the same thing 6 more times between 1985 and 1995. 6 young farmers who couldn't get financing, couldn't get started, couldn't get anyone to give them a chance. Earl leased them land on generous terms, lent them equipment, taught them what his father had taught him. Never owe more than you can pay off in one bad year. By 2000, all 6 of those farmers owned their own land. 3 of them had expanded beyond what they'd leased from Earl. One of them, Danny Reeves, was farming 340 acres free and clear. Every single one credited Earl Hawkins with giving them their start. Donnie Granger heard about it. He'd been selling insurance in Platte City for 16 years, living a quiet life, trying not to think about the dealership. But Earl's name kept coming up. Earl helped Danny Reeves get started. Earl leased land to the Morrison kid. Earl gave the Pratt boy a tractor to use for 2 seasons. In the fall of 2000, Donnie drove out to Earl's farm. He found Earl in the barn replacing a wheel bearing on the Farmall Super M. The tractor was 47 years old, still running. "Earl," Earl looked up. "Donnie Granger, been a while." "It has." Donnie looked around the barn. Same barn from 1967, same tools on the wall, same 2 Farmalls, both older than most of the farmers in the county. "You still using these tractors?" "Every day. They're over 50 years old, Earl." "So am I. We're all still working." Donnie was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down on a hay bale and said what he'd come to say. "I told you that you were too old for this. In 1967. You came in for a hydraulic fitting, and I told you to modernize or quit. Called you a relic. I remember. I was 36 years old. I thought I knew everything about farming because I sold tractors. I didn't know anything. I sold debt disguised as progress. And most of the farmers who listened to me lost everything." "That wasn't all your fault, Donnie." "Maybe not, but I made it easy. I made debt sound smart. And the one farmer who never listened to me, the one I called too old, is the one who kept his farm and helped a dozen other people keep theirs." Earl set down his wrench. "My daddy had a rule: never owe more than you can pay off in 1 bad year. I followed that rule my whole life. That's all I did. That rule saved you. That rule saved everyone I taught it to." Donnie nodded, stood up, looked at the Super M one more time. "How much did you pay for that tractor?" $1,400 in 1958. "And it's still running." "It'll run as long as somebody takes care of it." $1,400. Donnie shook his head. "I sold Tom Bridwell a $12,000 tractor that put him out of business. You bought a $1,400 tractor that's still working 42 years later. I think about that more than I should. Don't be too hard on yourself, Donnie. You believed what you were taught. We all do. Yeah, but what you were taught was right." He drove away. Earl went back to the wheel bearing. Let me tell you where Earl Hawkins ended up, because this story has one more turn. In 2003, the Platte County Spring Equipment Auction held its annual sale. Earl was 85 years old. He'd been attending auctions for over 20 years. This time, a 240-acre parcel came up. The former Fenton place, the farm Dale Fenton had lost in 1984. The land had passed through 2 owners since then, neither of whom had taken care of it. Earl bought it. $14,000 cash, his 9th farm purchase. He didn't keep it for himself. He leased it to Danny Reeves's son, who was 23, and just starting out. Same terms Earl had given Danny 18 years earlier. 20% of the crop after harvest, free use of equipment. And one rule: never owe more than you can pay off in 1 bad year. Earl Hawkins died in 2009 at 91 years old. He'd farmed for 63 years. He owned 840 acres, all paid for, all purchased with cash at auctions over 4 decades. He never bought a new tractor. The 1946 Farmall H ran until 2001, 55 years. The 1953 Super M ran until 2007, 54 years. Both are in a farm museum in Platte City now, displayed side by side with a plaque that reads, "These tractors farmed 840 acres over 6 decades without a single bank payment. At Earl's funeral, Danny Reeves spoke. Earl Hawkins gave me 80 acres and a tractor older than I was. He told me to take care of the tractor and never owe more than one bad year's income. I followed that advice for 24 years. I own 340 acres free and clear today because of it. But Earl didn't just help me. He helped 6 other farmers get started the same way, and those farmers helped others, and those helped others. There are over 30 farms operating in this county today that trace back to Earl Hawkins and an old Farmall with a bad wheel bearing. The John Deere dealer told Earl he was too old to farm, said his equipment was from the Truman administration, said he was a relic who needed to modernize or quit. 18 years later, the dealer was out of business. Most of his customers had lost their farms, and Earl Hawkins was the only one left standing. But Earl wouldn't tell this story as a story about being right. He'd tell it as a story about a rule. My daddy said never owe more than you can pay off in one bad year. That's it. That's the whole secret. Everybody wants a complicated answer, but the answer is simple. Don't owe what you can't cover. Everything else takes care of itself. He paused. Then he smiled. And take care of your tractors. They'll take care of you. So, let me leave you with this. Right now, somewhere, someone is being told they're too old, too slow, too small, too old-fashioned. Someone is being told they need to borrow, expand, modernize, keep up. Someone is being told that the way they've always done things isn't good enough anymore. The J.D. dealer told a 49-year-old farmer he was too old for this, said his tractors were relics, said he'd be finished in 5 years. 18 years later, Earl owned 520 acres free and clear. The dealer's business was gone, and the farmers Earl helped were building operations of their own with a rule they learned from a man everyone called a relic, because Earl understood something the dealer never did. The best equipment isn't the newest, the best strategy isn't the biggest, and the best farmers aren't the ones who grow the fastest. They're the ones who are still standing when everything else falls apart. If this story changed how you think about debt, equipment, and what it really means to build something that lasts, do 3 things. Subscribe for more forgotten stories of American agriculture. Drop a comment and tell me, what's the best advice you ever received from someone older than you? And share this with someone who's being told they need to keep up when what they really need is to hold on. The dealer said he was too old. Earl outlasted them all, and the rule his daddy taught him saved 30 farms. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.